Have you ever stopped to think about how major historical events might actually line up with biblical prophecies,
Yeah.
especially about when they really found their ultimate fulfillment?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? How history and prophecy intersect,
Exactly. So today we're going to, well, really dig into that. We're exploring an important area of biblical study called eschatology.
which sounds complex, but it just means the study of end times or ultimate destiny kind of prophecy. There are historical records, quite a bit of recent archaeological discovery, actually, and careful scriptural interpretation. The goal is to try and pinpoint the true chronological markers for prophetic fulfillment. We're not just, skimming the surface here.
Okay, so our mission today is basically to unpack this. Was all biblical prophecy definitively fulfilled way back with the temple's destruction in 70 CE?
Or does the whole biblical narrative kind of demand a broader, maybe more ultimate conclusion?
We really want to help you, our listener, discern what actually happened and why getting that timing right gives us a much richer view of God's, well, meticulous plan.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this, though. Full preterism, at its core, it argues that all prophetic fulfillment just concluded, wrapped up in 70 CE with the temple destruction in Jerusalem.
It's a very specific viewpoint, kind of a contained view of history and prophecy. It offers this decisive endpoint.
And to be fair, 70 CE was monumental. I mean, absolutely huge.
Oh, unquestionably. It was devastating. The temple destroyed, the sacrificial system ended, a major judgment on apostate Israel at the time. Those events were seismic, no doubt about it.
They really echoed through history.
They did. However, and this is really where our deep dive gets going, while 70 CE was incredibly significant, the analysis we're looking at shows it wasn't the complete fulfillment.
Okay, so not the end of the story.
Exactly. Think of it more like the penultimate event.
Yeah.
The second to last super crucial step, but just not the ultimate finish line.
And grasping that distinction is vital, right? For you listening, our research suggests that if you confine all fulfillment to 70 CE, well, you might be, as the analysis puts it, truncating the biblical narrative prematurely.
Yeah, it's like stopping a grand symphony right before its final, most triumphant movement. You miss the full resolution. And this brings us to a really critical clue from the prophet Daniel, chapter 12, verse 7. It talks about a time when the power of the holy people comes to an end.
Okay, Daniel 12.7, the power ending.
Right. And our sources consistently show that full preterism tends to misinterpret this key passage, focusing everything on 70 CE as that final shattering moment. But did that power really end then?
Here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Because when you look at the actual historical record, several aspects of this power of the holy people seem incredibly robust after 70 CE.
Like what, for instance?
Well, take political power. Far from vanishing, Jewish political aspirations actually seem to have intensified after 70 CE.
Right. You see that with the Bar Kokhba revolt, don't you?
Exactly. More than 60 years later. And this wasn't just some minor uprising. They were minting coins, declaring independence, even making a serious attempt to restore the temple. Does that really sound like completely shattered political power?
Not at all. It sounds like the opposite, actually. And get this, Jewish Messianic expectations? They actually amplified after 70 CE. They didn't end.
Amplified.
How so? Well, you have Rabbi Akiva, who is arguably the most revered sage of that era, openly proclaiming Bar Kokhba as the Messiah.
Wow.
Yeah, he'd be like based on that ancient prophecy, Numbers 24, a star shall come out of Jacob. That's powerful evidence that the ability to generate and sustain these huge messianic movements was still very much alive. Thriving even.
And the scale of it, you mentioned the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, he described it as stirring up the whole world.
That's right. Which clearly shows that Jewish communities in the diaspora, spread around the Roman Empire, they still had this incredible power for massive international coordination. Resistance against Rome on a global scale.
Decades after 70 CE, it's not a localized thing anymore.
Not at all. And finally, there's the religious authority. The ability of Jewish leaders to interpret prophecy their way, declare new messiahs, mobilize huge populations for what they believed was like eschatological warfare.
That power survived 70 CE too.
Clearly. And it actually seems to have peaked in the 130s during the Bar Kokhba revolt. So all of this points to a power base that was still vibrant, coordinated, and definitely unshattered after 70 CE.
Okay, so if 70 CE wasn't the final shattering, when was?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, The analysis argues that the true definitive shattering of that power of the holy people, fulfilling Daniel 12.7, only happened with the catastrophic defeat of the Bar Kokhba revolt between 132 and 136 CE.
So that was the ultimate fulfillment moment.
That's what the evidence strongly suggests. That was
Yeah.
the ultimate one.
Okay, so what specifically was shattered in 136 CE that hadn't been in 70?
Several key things. First, complete political obliteration. The Bar Kokhba defeat just crushed any realistic possibility of Jewish political independence or temple restoration forever.
Forever is a strong word.
Well, think about it. After Bar Kokhba, no significant Jewish movement has even attempted anything on that scale politically or militarily in that land for almost 2,000 years, until the modern era. The dream of a sovereign Jewish state in that biblical era was just extinguished.
Okay, and the Messianic hopes you mentioned.
Profoundly impacted. The catastrophic failure of Bar Kokhba, especially after top rabbis like Akiva had hailed him as Messiah, it thoroughly discredited those kinds of Jewish messianic expectations.
So no major claimant since then.
Not on that scale, not with that kind of backing. It really speaks to how final that shattering was for that specific type of messianic hope.
Makes sense. What else?
Well, the international Jewish coordination that made the revolt possible. That network was completely shattered. Jewish communities became much more isolated and, frankly, powerless for centuries afterwards.
And religiously.
A huge shift. This crushing defeat basically forced Judaism to abandon those apocalyptic nationalistic hopes tied to land and temple and kind of retreat into a more academic rabbinic study focused on preserving the law in exile. It really marked the definitive end of the Second Temple period's specific eschatological fervor.
Wow. Okay, so the argument is 136 CE is the real endpoint for that specific prophetic trajectory.
That's the core argument, yes.
Now, our analysis also points out something interesting, maybe a methodological issue within full preterism itself.
Yes, it highlights what the source calls an unhealthy dependence on one particular work from the 19th century.
Which one?
James Stuart Russell's book, The Parousia, published back in 1878.
Okay, 1878. Why is relying on that specific book a problem?
Well, it's a critical limitation because, understandably, 19th century scholarship just didn't have access to stuff we know now. Key discoveries were still decades away.
Like the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Exactly. Russell wrote long before those were found in 1947. And even more critically, he had absolutely no knowledge of Dr. Yigal Yadin's amazing discoveries in the 1960s.
What did Yadin find?
The Bar Kokhba caves, and crucially, the Bar Kokhba letters. Actual correspondence from the revolt.
Whoa, actual letters from Bar Kokhba.
Yes, direct first-hand evidence from the ground. And these letters, they reveal a Jewish military and administrative organization that was just staggering. Sophisticated, large-scale, something Russell could never have imagined based only on Roman sources.
What do they show specifically?
Things like administrative control over territory, complex military commands, economic systems supporting, get this, maybe over 400,000 troops?
400,000?
Potentially, yes. International coordination, explicit messianic claims by Bar Kokhba himself. And the fact that this correspondence just stops suddenly, definitively, right when the revolt was crushed. That's like documentary proof of when that power was truly and permanently shattered.
And Russell wouldn't have known any of this.
None of it. He worked mainly from classical Roman historians. He didn't have modern archaeology, didn't have detailed demographic studies showing this, well, exponential growth in Jewish military capability and political organization between 70 CE and 136 CE.
So his framework just assumed Jewish power ended in 70 CE.
Because he lacked the evidence that later emerged showing it didn't.
Yeah.
It actually regrouped and grew far more powerful before its final fall.
Okay. The analysis points to 3 specific errors in Russell's work.
Yes, 3 interconnected mistakes that kind of undermine the whole 70 CE endpoint idea.
What's mistake number 1?
Abandoning his own starting point. He correctly established that New Testament prophecy concerned the end of the Jewish age, the end of that covenant era.
Makes sense.
But then, the analysis argues, he systematically abandoned this premise. He allowed interpretations centered on Rome and Roman emperors to kind of override the primary Jewish historical context he himself had set up.
Okay, mistake number 2.
Making the Roman Emperor Nero the man of lawlessness.
Nero. But didn't he die before the temple was even destroyed?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nero died in 68 CE. The temple fell in 70 CE. Yet Russell identified Nero as the key figure behind it all, the ringleader of Jewish sedition. It creates these, well, impossible chronological problems.
Yeah, how can you be the ringleader of something that climaxes years after you're dead?
Precisely. It just doesn't fit the timeline without some serious interpretive gymnastics.
And mistake number 3.
This one is maybe the most telling. He dismissed Bar Kokhba as too extravagant.
Dismissed him. How?
Well, someone apparently suggested to Russell that Bar Kokhba might be the fulfillment of the final rebellion described in Revelation 20, and Russell just rejected it out of hand. In his book, The Parousia, page 522, he literally says the idea is too extravagant to be entertained for a moment.
Wow. But Bar Kokhba seems to fit so much of what you've described.
Exactly. That's the profound irony. Bar Kokhba represents everything Russell's framework should have embraced. A massive Jewish false messiah figure leading a final, huge rebellion against Rome, resulting in catastrophic judgment. He's almost the perfect candidate.
So these errors compound them.
Absolutely. Abandoning the Jewish context forced him toward Roman fulfillments like Nero. Centering on Nero created chronological impossibilities. And then, actively skipping over Bar Kokhba meant he completely missed the most obvious, powerful Jewish fulfillment, one that would have actually solved many of his own timeline problems.
It really raises a question about, intellectual honesty, doesn't it? How frameworks can sometimes resist evidence that doesn't fit.
It does. It's a cautionary tale in interpretation.
So it's this kind of tragic irony. Bar Kokhba seems like the ideal candidate for full preterism's core ideas.
A massive, decisive, Jewish, false messiah event ending in complete judgment, yes.
Yet Russell's dismissal kind of locked his followers into defending these inferior Roman interpretations, as the analysis calls them, instead of the clearer Jewish one.
That seems to be the case. They ended up defending a weaker chronological and contextual fit.
Okay, beyond the historical and methodological stuff, you mentioned mathematical challenges for the 70 CE view.
Yes, the numbers are pretty stark when you look at them.
Mm-hmm.
How can a power that was supposedly shattered in 70 CE
Right.
then increase maybe tenfold in terms of military mobilization 60 years later? Going from estimates of maybe 40,000 Jewish troops in the first revolt to potentially over 400,000 in the Bar Kokhba revolt. The full preterist position essentially asks us to believe that shattered means grew 10 times stronger.
Yeah, the math just doesn't seem to work there. Shattered should mean weaker or gone, not massively stronger.
Exactly. It requires ignoring some basic historical and numerical realities.
And what about specific prophecies, like, say, Ezekiel 38 and 39? That's a big one people discuss.
A very big one.
Yeah.
And it simply cannot fit 70 CE.
Why not?
Several reasons. Ezekiel describes the attack coming from the north, and the nations involved map more closely to diaspora regions, not Rome coming from the west. The composition of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel is different too. It seems to include wayward Israel itself, not just external Gentile enemies attacking Jerusalem.
Okay.
And the sheer scale described by Ezekiel, a cloud covering the land, many peoples, with Gog, that perfectly matches the descriptions we have of the global Bar Kokhba uprising involving Jews from all over. It just doesn't fit a localized Roman siege of Jerusalem like in 70 CE.
And the aftermath details.
Right. The burial details in Ezekiel, taking 7 months to cleanse the land because of the vast number of dead, that fits the scale of casualties reported for Bar Kokhba. Cashie's die mentions 580,000 Jewish dead, far, far exceeding anything recorded for the 70 CE siege itself.
So Ezekiel 38-39 doesn't fit 70 CE, but does it fit Bar Kokhba? It fits remarkably well, actually. Perfectly, you could argue. How so?
Well, the identity of the coalition led by Gog, if interpreted as wayward Israel under a false leader, which Bar Kokhba certainly was.
False Messiah, yeah.
Right. Jews who rejected Jesus and then followed this false Messiah. That fits. The international scope, covering the land like a cloud with many peoples drawn into the revolt, fits. The outcome of complete destruction and mass burials, fits. The timing, aligning with other prophetic markers pointing beyond 70, fits. And the consequences permanently ending that kind of nationalistic messianic ambition Ezekiel describes, fits perfectly.
That connects, doesn't it, to Peter's warning back in the book of Acts, chapter 3, verse 23.
How so? Remind us.
Peter quotes Moses saying, "Every soul who does not listen to that prophet," meaning Jesus, "shall be utterly destroyed from among the people."
Ah, yes. Utterly destroyed.
The Bar Kokhba followers seem to fit that description perfectly, don't they? They were the generation or generations who heard the gospel but ultimately chose to follow a false Messiah instead of the prophet Jesus.
And their end was indeed an utter destruction from among the people, politically, militarily, demographically.
It wasn't just the temple's fall. It was their complete removal as a competing national political force against the burgeoning Christian church.
That makes sense. And you can even see a framework in Revelation 20 playing out here.
Revelation 20. With Satan bound and released.
Exactly. It talks about Satan being bound, then released for a little while to deceive the nations one last time, then a final defeat.
How does that fit the 7136 timeline?
Well, you could see Satan's binding potentially happening from 70-73 CE after the temple's fall and the initial crushing of Jewish opposition. This allowed Christianity to really expand without that primary Jewish persecution hindering it.
Okay, a period of relative freedom for the church.
Then the release for a little while, maybe around 132 CE, with the massive Bar Kokhba uprising. Satan's final deception, using these potent, fresh, false messianic hopes to rally opposition one last time.
And the final defeat.
136 CE. The complete crushing of the revolt, which permanently ended the power of organized nationalistic Jewish resistance to Christ and his claims. It fits that pattern quite compellingly.
So, beyond the interpretations, are there other scriptural markers, like chronological ones, that point past 70 CE?
Yes, several. For instance, think about this generation in Matthew 24:34. Jesus says, "This generation will not pass away until all these things take place."
People usually tie that tightly to 70 CE.
They do, often calculating a generation as 40 years from Jesus' ministry. But a biblical generation could also be understood differently, sometimes up to 100 or even 120 years. If you calculate from Jesus' birth, around 4 BCE,
Okay.
a full biblical generation could easily extend right up to 136 CE. That timeline simply accommodates these later, larger events naturally.
Interesting. What else?
Luke 21:24. Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Well, Jerusalem remained trampled by Gentiles long after 70 CE, and Jewish hopes for restoration, for untrampling it, persisted right up until Bar Kokhba's catastrophic failure finally extinguished them in 136 CE. So the times of the Gentiles trampling wasn't truly fulfilled or sealed until that final defeat.
So the trampling wasn't just the 70 CE event, but the condition that lasted until 136.
Precisely. And you also have Daniel's extended time periods, the 1290 days, the 1335 days in Daniel 12. While interpretations vary, they certainly suggest intervals beyond the initial crisis, potentially pointing to these later conflicts in the 2nd century. They hint at a longer, unfolding timeline.
Okay, so we have historical arguments, methodological arguments, mathematical ones, interpretive fits like Ezekiel, chronological markers. What about physical evidence? So what does all this mean when we look at the actual, stuff dug up from the ground? What do the archaeologists tell us?
That's where it gets really compelling, too. The archaeological record strongly backs this extended timeline.
How so?
Well, take the Temple Mount itself. What tourists see today as the Western Wall. Those huge stones are mostly foundation stones from the Roman fortress, the Antonia fortress, built after 70 CE or later constructions.
Not the actual temple wall from Jesus' time.
Not primarily, no. The actual temple location, based on archaeological consensus now, shows evidence of complete obliteration. Just as Jesus prophesied, not one stone left on another of the temple itself.
Fulfilling that prophecy literally.
Yes. But then, critically, archaeologists have found widespread destruction layers across Judea dating specifically to the 130 CE, the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt.
And how do they compare to 70 CE destruction?
In many areas, the destruction from the 130s actually exceeds the devastation from 70 CE. It was incredibly widespread and violent.
Wow. More destruction later.
Yes. And perhaps most importantly, the demographic evidence. Studies show that the population displacement and death toll after the Bar Kokhba revolt was so total that the land of Judea remained largely empty, desolate for generations afterwards. It was a true, lasting demographic shattering that didn't happen to the same extent in 70 CE.
Okay, that paints a pretty comprehensive picture then, extending things to 136 CE.
It really does seem to tie all the different threads, historical, scriptural, archaeological, together more neatly.
So let's think about the implications. What are the risks, then, of sticking strictly to the 70 CE endpoint? What does it cost us in understanding?
Well, the analysis suggests that truncating prophecy at 70 CE has some profound implications. It potentially minimizes the full scope of God's judgment and justice. It can overlook the incredible precision of how all the prophetic details eventually played out.
You miss the full story, essentially.
You miss the full story, the complete victory God achieved over that specific form of opposition. And yeah, it truncates the whole narrative, making God's plan seem perhaps less complete or less meticulously fulfilled than it actually was by 136 CE.
And for the full preterist view itself, does this create challenges?
The analysis argues it comes with a kind of credibility cost. It can lead to a degree of academic isolation because it doesn't easily incorporate these later discoveries. There can be a tendency towards evidential selectivity. focusing only on evidence that fits the 70 CE box,
Right, ignoring the inconvenient data.
potentially, which can lead to a kind of theological stagnation. And ultimately, it might weaken the position's ability to explain and defend its claims convincingly against the weight of evidence pointing to 136.
So is there a name for this alternative view, the one that extends to 136?
Some scholars refer to it as the atavist position, though it's not a widely known label. But the core idea is simply recognizing that eschatological fulfillment related to the end of the Jewish age was a process.
A process, not just a single event.
Exactly, a series of interconnected events culminating in 136 CE. And this timeline, this view, it seems to honor Christ's perfect timing better. It explains how Christianity managed to survive and grow while God was systematically, eliminating the primary alternative claimant, nationalistic Messianic Judaism.
It accounts for more details.
It seems to account for all the prophetic details, including scale, timing, and consequences, without needing forced interpretations. It demonstrates God's thoroughness, his complete victory. And critically, it provides historical verification through well-documented events and archaeological finds.
And the goal isn't just to stick to an old interpretation.
Absolutely not. The goal highlighted in our deep dive is always the pursuit of truth, not loyalty to any particular scholar from the 19th century, like Russell, however influential he was. It's about following the evidence where it leads.
Okay, so to summarize this whole deep dive for you, our listener, while 70 CE was undeniably monumentally important.
The penultimate event. Crucial, but not final.
Right, the destruction of the temple, the beginning of a profound judgment. But the ultimate fulfillment, the point where Daniel's prophecy about the power of the holy people being completely shattered, truly happened.
That seems to have come only with the Bar Kokhba catastrophe ending in 136 CE.
And the evidence for this longer timeline seems pretty strong.
It appears overwhelming when you put it all together. You've got archaeological discoveries Russell never knew about, the mathematical and historical impossibilities within that limited 70 CE framework, and a clear testimony of Scripture itself, which often describes God's work, including judgment and fulfillment, as an unfolding process, not just a single snapshot moment.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. When any interpretive framework, whatever it is confronted with just overwhelming contradictory evidence, how deeply committed is it to its own assumptions?
That's a key question.
Yeah.
Why embrace an interpretation that seems to systematically suppress or dismiss vital historical and archaeological data that points to a different conclusion?
What's the path forward, then, for understanding this area of prophecy?
Well, the analysis suggests the path forward is simply to integrate all the evidence honestly, integrate modern discoveries, recognize that God's prophetic program concerning the end of that specific Jewish age reached its meticulous fulfillment in 136 CE.
Seeing it as one connected whole.
Exactly. Viewing the entire period, really from maybe 62 CE with the death of James, through 70 up to 136 CE, as one unified parousia, one seamless chain of events demonstrating God's unwavering faithfulness to accomplish everything he promised regarding that specific covenant age.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for walking us through that analysis.
My pleasure. It's incredibly important material.
And thank you, our listener, for joining us on this deep dive. We definitely encourage you to keep exploring these incredible connections between history, archaeology, and prophecy for yourself.